The chants of young and old Iraqis echoed through the streets of Baghdad last year as they roared for justice. It is 1 year since the popular anti-establishment protest started in Iraq. A year on, where does the country stand? When Iraqis first took to the streets on October 1, 2019, their anger was born out of years of frustration. The 2003 US invasion not only undermined any semblance of security in Iraq, it created a corrupt and sectarian political class that has left the country's economy in ruins. According to the World Bank, Iraq has fourth largest proven reserves of oil, but in 2014, more than 22% of its population of 40 million people were living on less than $2 a day. So in October 2019, frustration over a lack of basic services, rampant political corruption, and interference from Iran led young Iraqis to say, enough.
What separates these protests in the last year from previous protests is the demands are stronger. The demands are not just only for jobs and electricity and water, because you've seen those for a long time in Iraq after 2003. But they call it a revolution. I mean, they're calling for the end of a political system, this political system of post-2003 that was put to them, enforced on them by foreign actors as well as Iraqi elite working with the US-led coalition. I think the best way to understand these protests is as a societal backlash to 18 years of misgovernance and traumatic governance on a young generation that really sees a bleak future.
Within days, protesters quickly took over Tahrir Square in the heart of the capital Baghdad, setting up tents and fighting battles with the police. By October 5th, the death toll in the anti-government protest had soared to at least 70 as clashes between protesters and police intensified. The protests and the subsequent deaths were seen as the first major challenge to Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi's fragile government nearly a year after he came to power. After the first wave of protests ended on October 9th, Prime Minister Mahdi promised to reshuffle his cabinet and work on reducing unemployment. But the protests erupted again on October 25th after his refusal to also call in early elections. By the time he stepped down on November 30th, more than 250 people had been killed in clashes with security forces. But his departure meant nothing to protesters. This was not what they were fighting for. Iraqis were protesting to put an end to endemic corruption, have life's basic services restored, and a rejection of Iranian influence on their political system that awards positions to political parties based on ethnic and sectarian identity. It is a process, they say, that has been encouraging favoritism and corruption in Iraqi politics for years, dividing the country in the middle, with a corrupt ruling elite on one hand and ordinary suffering Iraqis on the other. Since the US invasion, Iran's influence over Iraq's internal affairs has grown steadily.
A lot of Iran's policymakers remember the brutal 8-year war between Iraq and Iran in the 1980s. So Iran's goal has always been to make sure that Iraq is never that strong to pose as a neighboring threat. But at the same time, I think Iran has also learned, particularly in 2014 when ISIS came to its doorsteps in Iraq, that Iraq cannot be too weak to allow security threats to emerge. So it needs to find the balance of an Iraq that's not too strong and not too weak. At the same time, to do so, what Iran does is it engages the Iraqi state as almost a network. So it has relationships across the political parties.
By the end of December 2019, the Iraqi Parliament's Human Rights Commission said at least 490 protesters had been killed since the beginning of the protests. Between February and March, Iraq had two temporary prime ministers. First, a former communication minister, Muhammad Alawi, who gave way to Adnan al-Zarfi, who withdrew his candidacy to make way for country's intelligence chief, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, to be Iraq's new prime minister. Mustafa al-Kadhimi finally took oath as country's prime minister in May.
He's facing two camps. You have the protesters on one side, and you have the sort of political parties on the other side. And he's trying to make both sides happy. So while he talks about reform and he talks about change and uses the language that the protesters have been using, he also still allows the political parties to generate the rents the way they do, to continue the corrupt practices that they do. He doesn't want to go after the major political parties as such. He still needs them in parliament and in politics. So in the end, what he has is one foot in the elite camp and one foot in the protest camp, but that makes him kind of rejected in a way by both.
There's a constant fear lurking in the streets of Iraq of being assassinated. In the month of July and August 2019, angry Iraqis again took to the streets, protesting the killing of civil rights activists and journalists. Assassinations of Tahsin Usama, Riham Yaqub, and Husham al-Hashimi sent shockwaves across the country. A year on from the protests, the biggest worry now is the pandemic. It has brought much of the world to a standstill, leading to the global collapse of demand for oil, and has pushed Iraq's economy to the brink of catastrophe.
Protests go in waves, right? It's not like you could have mass mobilization for months and months and months and months. What I would be looking at instead are, have the roots been addressed? Because if the roots of why Iraqis are going to the streets haven't been addressed, they're going to come back.
Iraqis have vowed to keep the protests going unless their demands of a peaceful homeland are met.